Hello, my name is Edwin Weber. I'm one of the pastors at St. Mark's Lutheran Church in Spokane, Washington. I am recording this lecture, this talk, after presenting this Lutheran Theology of Worship talk at a Sunday forum at St. Mark's on March 28th, 2021. And the conversation, the discussion was so rich and joyful that it was requested that I record this talk so that others in the future could watch it and benefit from it. So we are going to be talking briefly about worship principles as Lutherans, what it means to be Lutheran, what is our theology of worship, what are the things that guide us when we are planning worship, or the principles that go into our shared community experience for worship. And the truth is, there are many different ideas about how a worship planning, corporate worship planning comes together. Maybe you've got an impression that whomever is the pastor, we just sort of sit down, we make all the calls about what goes into the liturgy, hymns, prayers, all of that, and that it reflects a personal preference of the worship leaders. The reality is that worship planning is not a vanity exercise. It is more of a collaborative endeavor where your worship leaders work together to bring something that is not a reflection of personal preference, but rather an organization of worship elements that foster praise and reflection. And I'll just say this, I think that most people probably won't appreciate worship that's organized by Pastor Edwin Weber around the principle that it is what I want. Because I would, of course, just do the things with worship that speak to me and speak to my spirituality, that are my favorite things to do. But they may not necessarily speak to you. I'm sure we all share things that we enjoy about worship that we share with others. But if our guiding principle for our worship was, this individual chooses, most people are going to be left behind. So a fundamental principle for our worship is that it is corporate. And it is organized in a way to keep inclusiveness and participation in mind. And when I say inclusiveness, I do mean like that principle of inclusion of people with different spiritual idioms that speak to them. And so trying to craft a worship liturgy that is beneficial for everyone. Or most people, but also inclusive in the sense of people that might have barriers to worship. So we think about things like handicap accessibility. We make large print bulletins. We have a volunteer who signs the liturgy for our deaf and hard of hearing members. And so that inclusiveness is something that we keep in mind as a fundamental principle, because worship is participatory, as we will see. Now, these concepts, may not be entirely foreign to you. It's certainly familiar, and it makes sense that the worship service is not a vanity exercise of our pastors. But it is interesting as a pastor to see the ways in which this principle is tested among our faithful siblings of Christ. And the best example I can give is probably hymn selection. Where we see this really most clearly, because there are a lot of very strong opinions about the music that we use. And there is a feeling among some that we should use hymns that are enjoyable, music that puts a pep in our step. And we do sometimes accept hymn requests, and they are, to be perfectly honest, they are honestly requested simply because I like this hymn. It is a joyful hymn. It's an enjoyable hymn for me. And don't get me wrong, there is nothing wrong with just enjoying music. But we don't select our hymns simply based upon what is enjoyable. Because worship is not about us, is it? Worship is about God. Our praise and our thanksgiving to God And this is what our worship is about. It's about praise and thanksgiving. And so our worship has been framed around sort of two centers for centuries, millennia even. Worship is centered around word and sacrament. We receive God's word as part of every worship service that we gather for, and we dwell on it richly. That's what the sermon is. It is an interpretation, a proclamation of God's word. And in the best of times, we also receive tangible signs of God's grace in the sacraments. And on Sunday mornings, this is principally the Lord's Supper, of course. So this form of word and meal, the central expression of our worship lives, are also paired with a gathering and ascending, which gathering and sending, they just do just what the names imply. They gather us, they send us out into the world. Now we have our principal fourfold Sunday service, which consists of gathering, word, meal, and sending. Now, I like to call these acts, or as a musician, sometimes I call them the four movements of our liturgy. And the truth is, you can see this basically any Sunday that we gather for worship. So pick up your worship folder, pick up your hymnal, look, you will see these four acts, these four movements of gathering, word, meal, and sending reflected in our worship materials. Now, we don't have a service book and hymnal from the first century that goes all the way back to the inception of Christianity. And while the earliest records of Christian worship aren't complete and full, we do have a good idea of what the early Christians did for worship. And the thing is, this basic fourfold form of worship was used from the very earliest days of the church. Now, this is important for us to remember because as we look at Luther and the Lutherans, as they were coming together as a group, they were shaping and forming their worship practices around this concept of these ancient traditions which had been carried over. So it's really important to remember something you'll hear often about Luther and the Lutherans, which is that Luther was not trying to break away from the church. He was trying to reform it. So the Lutherans were not interested in just throwing away everything that the church had and starting over with a blank slate. Instead, the Lutherans were reformers. We're interested in taking what the church already had, what already existed, sometimes for centuries, sometimes for millennia, over a millennia, I should say at that point, and tweak them, adjust them, change them to the things, to modify them to their faith and beliefs. But they only did this lightly. Only the things that really didn't pass muster, and only those things that were for the sake of reform in regards to their movement. When it comes to the liturgy and worship, this means that the Lutherans were, and still are to this day, very interested in keeping a fundamental principle. This is known as Catholicity. And I try not to use big words, big church words, but Catholicity is, I think, a good word to use. And it's not all that different. But let me take a moment to explain what I mean here. It's familiar to us. We use the word Catholic in our creeds when we confess our faith on Sunday, right? We say, we believe in one holy Catholic, or we can say universal church. So this word, Catholic, Catholicity, is about universality. What is present around a lot. So we were very interested in what people do for worship, what people have done for worship. So we look at this ancient form of the fourfold worship of gathering, word, meal, and sending, and the Lutherans kept it. They kept that and just made changes to it. So again, remember, we as Lutherans, we are interested in what we share in common with others in our worship practices. And in particular, what we share in common with generations past. Thus, Lutherans kept the worship principle in form, I should say, right? So the service really didn't change all that much from how it was prior to the Reformation and how it was afterwards. Generally speaking, the Lutherans did not invent new rituals. They just reshaped and reformed pre-existing rites and worship forms. As Lutherans, and this is something I love, we share a common liturgical history really with all Christians. The first 4 or 5 centuries of the Common Era share in totality, our liturgical history is shared in totality with the Eastern Orthodox churches. We share a common liturgical history with Roman Catholics through the 16th century. And we still share very close liturgical relationship with the Roman Catholic Church and Episcopalians, and to a lesser degree share common principles with Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists, and many, many others. Now, the reason that we share this common liturgical heritage is that the principal form of worship around we gather is common. We share in common this fourfold form. Now, by Luther's day, that vague form that we see in antiquity had evolved and taken on a more defined and detailed form, but it still was a fundamentally gathering, word, meal, sending. And that form has a name. Had a name back then and still has one to this day. And it's a word you're probably familiar with. The word is Mass, the Mass. However, in common parlance, in English at least, we commonly refer to Mass as the worship service of Roman Catholics. And we, for example, if you look at our bulletin, we often call it something like Holy Communion or Holy Eucharist. Some Lutherans use the term divine service. That kind of harkens back to the Eastern Orthodox. That's what they refer to it as. The term Gottesdienst in German, which isn't perfectly translated into English very well, but means something kind of like the Lord's service or God's service, again, kind of implying divine liturgy, divine service. And there were other terms and have been terms that have been used. But the thing is, whether you call it Mass, whether you call it Holy Communion, divine service, whatever you call it, we share that worship form in common with Roman Catholics and Episcopalians, and to a lesser degree, Eastern Orthodox Christians. Basically, you can walk into any of those churches on Sunday morning, and you will find that our worship service share not only the basic form, but really are quite similar to one another. And if you've been to a Catholic service or an Orthodox service or an Episcopalian service, you may probably know this. Orthodox service is a little bit different, but you do still see the basic form and shape of the liturgy. And in many of these other traditions, you do as well. Many of them often don't have a communion every Sunday, so the form is a little bit different. But again, very, very similar. And again, it's because all of these worship services really share a common root in the medieval Mass of the Western Church. Luther himself called it Mass. His German service, his Deutsche Messe, literally means German Mass. And that's what Luther titled his German language service. Many German speakers still do call it Mass, Messe, Deutsche Messe, or some version of that. And you will find some English speakers who are Protestant who still refer to it as Mass. So I don't want there to be confusion. I'm just using this as a technical term. But again, remember, whether it's Holy Communion, Mass, Divine Liturgy, whatever it is, we're all talking about the same worship form. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about the German Mass, the Deutsche Messe, a little bit later on. We'll also talk a little bit more about the abuses of the Mass that Luther and his contemporaries see. But I just wanted to focus here for a moment that the basic principle is that the Mass, as it was can stand with some modification. And this modification is largely around some clarity, if you will, around what was necessary versus what was just nice human tradition. So the reformers make a big point of distinguishing this. So, for example, Luther writes that in Mass you can use any number of what had been and is still today traditional trappings of liturgical worship. Things like candles and torches and processional crosses, prayers, robes, vestments. He even says that incense can still be used in liturgical worship. But the principle here is meant to separate, to distinguish what's necessary for the ritual to be fulfilled from that which might be enjoyable or edifying in a community's spiritual life, but which is not necessary. Now, this is in large part because in Luther's day there was a lot of confusion about what was necessary, and specifically, what was necessary for salvation. This confusion is really at the heart of Luther's desire for reformation because he greatly feared how the laity were being led astray. There was this confusion about salvation. And historically, it's why we start the conversation with the 95 Theses, which are against indulgences. And that's a really good place to start because it illustrates this point very, very well. So for a moment, we're going to talk about indulgences, and then we'll turn back to worship itself in just a moment. But remember, these indulgences, they were a document that the church claimed that the bearer had a documentation of forgiveness for themselves or for somebody else. And they could be bought and sold for a price. And Luther rejected this notion, this idea that God's grace could be bought or sold. And again, remember, forgiveness of sin. It is a grace of God. And so if indulgences were being bought and sold, that means that forgiveness was being bought and sold. And that means grace was being bought and sold. And Luther rejected this idea of the church trying to sell God's grace. But it wasn't just about indulgences. God's grace was sold in many different forms in Luther's day. And one of them was the private Mass. Now, this is a really foreign concept to us today because Lutherans, we do not do private Masses. Most Roman Catholics are not familiar with the private Mass. And even among Roman Catholics, they are not bought and sold really all that commonly today. But the idea is that you could you could go to the local priest and you could literally buy a service for yourself or for a loved one. And when I say for a loved one, I'm usually meaning somebody who is deceased, and they thought that these people were in purgatory, and so to get them out of purgatory, there was this idea that the Mass could be said for the dead to cause salvation to be inflicted. And so when we say a Mass for somebody else, for the dead, we might get this idea that it was like a memorial service, but it wasn't. It wasn't something that you would go and it was a remembrance of your loved one who was deceased. It was simply a perfunctory rite to tick off a little bit of grace to grant that person in purgatory so they could get out faster. So very, very different concept from the early church, as Luther reflected on, and from how we tend to think about our spiritual lives today. So when you read the Book of Concord, and that is the book of our Lutheran confessions, it's the book of our Lutheran beliefs, you really get this impression that this was an important point for Lutherans, to abolish the private Mass, to abolish the buying and selling of worship services. The average, it's important for us to understand, the average layperson in Luther's day, they lived in such abject fear of damnation every day that it sounds it sounds to me like a great perversion of the very point of God's abundant grace that's given in the sacraments in the first place. God gave us those sacraments so we didn't have to worry about salvation day in and day out and focus on other things. So Luther and his contemporaries sought to reform this. And this is why we see in the guiding principles of Lutheran worship that emerge in our confessional documents, specifically about the private Mass. So yes, among Lutherans, the abolishment of the private Mass was done really, really quickly. Masses weren't being bought and sold among the Lutherans anymore. But the root of this misunderstanding among the laity about these things of faith really comes from a lack of communication and education on key aspects of our faith. And these formed key aspects of the Reformation as well. And this is simply the truth when you can't communicate well with one another if you're speaking a dead language, right? Of course, I'm alluding to the fact that in Luther's day, the worship was done entirely in Latin, not in German, or for that matter, in English. Vernacular, whatever vernacular language, local language, had been used in the Eastern churches forever. And still the Eastern Orthodox churches still do have their services in the vernacular. And it perhaps was also this case in the Western Church. But after the fall of Rome, there was a great emphasis, particularly in the 7th and 8th centuries, on all things that were ancient and Roman. This was an outgrowth of the Frankish kings. Think about Charlemagne, right, who had himself crowned king of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, right? There was nothing particularly Roman about it at all, other than the fact that he was trying to draw on this concept of the Roman Empire. And remember, what did he call himself? What did the German kings call themselves? Kaiser, which is just a Germanization of the Latin word Caesar, right? So this is what was happening in the day. It's why the Latin liturgy in Western Europe was just sort of established, and it's why Luther and his contemporaries inherited the Latin liturgy of the Middle Ages. Now, in some ways, the Latin liturgy preserves a form of Catholicity that we talked about, that principle of universality that we said is desirable earlier on. Basically, you can think about it this way, that the words of the liturgy were all the same wherever you were worshiping on Sunday. And no matter where you were in Europe, whether you were in Wittenberg, or if you were in London, or if you were in Paris, the liturgy was the same. Now, we know that there were regional variations, so this is an oversimplification, but it was part of the principle of the medieval thought of why to keep it in Latin this way. But the drawback to a Latin liturgy was that the laity didn't understand anything. And when you stand up and essentially speak gibberish for an hour, generation after generation, there are a number of confusions and bad implied theology that works their way into our thinking. So it's not like this. A lot of these things, when we talk about what it was in the early church, where it was in the medieval church, and how Luther and his contemporaries changed things, it's hard to understand that transition to the medieval theology. But it's important to remember it was gradual. A lot of it was that you were separated from understanding because you couldn't read the Bible. It wasn't in Latin. It was in Latin. You didn't have access to a Bible. So these are principles that will be challenged by Luther and the Lutherans in the 16th century. So this confusion contributed to this concept that the Mass is, specifically the sacrament of the Lord's table could be bought and sold, buying and selling grace, as we discussed. And it really comes from this idea that Mass was a good work that could affect salvation, even for the dead. And I use the phrase "good work" to imply on that Paulian conversation of that faith versus good works. And you may remember that passage is read every Reformation Sunday because of its connection to this principle in our Lutheran thinking and in the Lutheran Reformation. So to root out these misunderstandings about faith, about spirituality, about the liturgy, about worship, about all of these things, Luther and his contemporaries broke down the barriers to access theological conversation that had up to that point mostly been held in Latin. So now we see that Luther was interested in a conversation in German, or at least theoretically in whatever vernacular language one might speak. So we see that Luther translates the Bible into German. We see Reformation pamphlets that were printed not just in Latin for the academics and the priests to discuss, but also in German for the laity to read and to think about. But it did take a long time for Luther to compile a vernacular liturgy, his Deutsche Messe, his German Mass. And that is because of certain musical principles that Luther felt were very, very important to his liturgical work. Now, one thing that's important for us to remember is that in Luther's day, everything that was spoken in the liturgy today was actually sung. It was chanted. The whole body of Latin prayers, readings, rituals, all of it had a setting to Gregorian chant. And many of these Gregorian chants, they still survive in our hymnal today. So you can pick up our hymnal and you can find hymns like Christians to the Paschal Victim. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Creator Spirit, Heavenly Dove, these hymns that go way, way back into the medieval period. And so they are chants, so a little bit different. But a lot of that Gregorian music didn't really translate very well because Gregorian music was crafted with the Latin language in mind. So I want to do a silly demonstration here to illustrate this point. So I want you to listen to this sentence I'm about to say. You put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. I'm going to say that again. You put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Now, I pronounced every word in that sentence correctly. The only thing I changed was where the stress of the words fall, right? Emphasis instead of emphasis, syllable instead of syllable. So it's important for us to remember that the pattern of stresses in language matter, and they are in fact necessary for understanding. They're necessary to make sense. Now, Luther understood this, and he wanted to ensure that the vernacular liturgy he compiled was a reflection of the character of that language. And it took a longer period of time than he and others might have liked. This is something that we experience as pastors. Right now we're making reopening plans for us. And a lot of people in the congregation, they want reopening plans to come out yesterday. And we're saying, please be patient with us. We want to do this right. And doing it right, doing it well takes time. So a lot of people, in a similar way, wrote Luther. It's like, hey, hurry up on your German Mass. We want to have this. And Luther asked for patience because he wanted to make sure, that he wasn't just sitting down and translating prayers from Latin to German and then just using the Gregorian chants now in German. It wouldn't work well. So instead, what he did was he would translate the liturgy. He'd make little changes, pruning and tweaking along the way, if you will. But these were small changes, and usually just to kind of bring the liturgies a little bit more in line with Lutheran theology. Then, these translations were set to German chants and hymns with these to reflect this new Lutheran theology. Now, these translations were then set to German chants and hymns that were newly composed, not new theology, newly composed music for the vernacular liturgy. Big distinction. Remember, Luther reformed the church. It's not necessarily seeking to break away. Now, Luther, to do this, collaborated with several musicians. He was seeking good artistry, music, and linguistic principles all along the way, which really conveys to us, the liturgy is something that's to be well crafted. Again, not a vanity exercise, right? Sometimes I use the word curate to talk about the role of the liturgist, right? That sometimes it implies an eliteness, like I as a pastor am sort of like a gatekeeper for the liturgy, which is not really how I mean it. Sometimes I was talking about being a hunter-gatherer, right? We are collaborators, we are curators, we are hunter-gatherers. We assemble different things with important principles in mind: good theology, good artistry, good linguistic principles all along the way. Now, arguably, there was only one true addition to the Mass that Lutherans added. And the Lutherans acknowledged this in the Book of Concord, that book of our confessions, that dialogue between Catholics and Lutherans. And this addition is one arguably really unique change, was that the Lutherans added vernacular hymns to the worship service that were not previously part of the Latin liturgy. So if you look in the Middle Ages, right, look at the Latin liturgy, there's no hymn of the day. There's no gathering hymn. The gathering hymn, there was something liturgical in its place, but the Lutherans inserted a hymn. There was no prayer of the day. Hymn of the day, I should say. That was something that Lutherans added. And it is perhaps the one most notable, unique innovation of the Lutherans. Now, I'm actually hoping that I'm going to be doing a second part to this talk a little bit later this spring. And with that talk, I just want to talk about just the treasury of hymnody that we as Lutherans steward, because we are singers. Our music is a big part of our tradition. And yes, I could spend a whole session just talking about Lutheran principles of music and our hymns. And so look forward to that maybe sometime after Easter, a little bit later this spring. But for now, I'm not going to elaborate too much on the hymns and the hymnody and the music beyond what I've already said. Just other than to say that this is where the German chorale hymn is born, and where we get all those beautiful Reformation hymns like A Mighty Fortress and others. Interestingly enough, Luther did use many traditional Latin hymns that he translated into a poetic form of German, and then he then had it set to music to sing. And the musicians, sort of a nod back to those Latin hymns, would often use the first line of the music in the hymn in the German Lutheran version of the hymn. So I'm going to give you an example here, very appropriate. There's an ancient Easter hymn that was sung every Easter and is still in many communities. We could sing it, called Victime Paschali Laudus. So in Latin, the chant is Victime Paschali Laudus. Luther's German translation of this hymn starts this way. Christ Jesus lay in death's strong bands. So you can hear that opening line in the German hymn was borrowed from the Latin hymn. And if you look at the Latin hymn and the English version of Luther's German hymn, you will see a lot of it he just translated, some of it he tweaked to be more reflective of Lutheran theology. Some of it he tweaked to be more instructive to the laity, and that's how all of these hymns are framed. They were inserted into the liturgy to be instructive, to help lay people understand their faith better. And Luther wrote he wrote a hymn on the Lord's Prayer. He wrote a hymn on the Creed. He wrote a hymn on the Ten Commandments. So you can see Luther was very much, and his contemporaries were very much trying to compose hymns that were instructive to the laity. And that's why they were included in the liturgy. So again, by and large, we can say that Luther was not interested in crafting a liturgy wholly from new cloth, but rather he and his fellow Lutherans sought to reform the liturgy as they sought to reform the church. And so gently, lightly, prune and tweak what already existed and had existed for centuries. The main differences were largely that Lutherans wanted the service to be in the vernacular, and they also added hymns that were instructive for the faith. Now, there were other minor changes. Minor is a relative term. Maybe I'm saying that minor in the fact that they were not quite so big and impactful. These other lingering tweaks and changes which the Lutherans enacted in the 16th century, I do want to briefly discuss because they were important to the Lutherans in those days. They also do change some of the ways in which we as Lutherans worship to this day. Some of the shifts and changes have lingering effects on our worship lives because of them, even though we may not necessarily see same kinds of things. So one of the big things out there that was a point of contention between Catholics and Lutherans, one of the areas where we do see some theological butting of heads, is over communion. And communion is something bittersweet to talk about today because we are now over a year into our Eucharistic fast, abstaining from the feast of life during this time, which we are separated from one another. But Eucharist, communion, Lord's Supper, was something that was very important to Lutherans and to our worship principles in the earliest days of us as Lutherans. Now, we've already spoken about the different aspects of what the Book of Concord often called some of the abuses of the Mass. One of them being the most acutely realized abuse was that the sacrament was regularly withheld from the laity. In fact, most Sundays, most worship services, if you were a lay person, you did not receive communion. This is quite interesting and perhaps odd to us today because we really don't see this practice very much, even in Roman Catholic communities. When they have Mass, Eucharist is available for the assembly. You may, as a Lutheran visitor, you may not be invited to the table, but as a general rule, it is open and accessible to the assembly at large. Every Sunday in Luther's day, there still was a Mass, and that means that there was a meal portion where bread and wine was offered to God in the Lord's Supper. But the bread and wine were not regularly distributed to the community of worshipers. Rather, it was the priests and the deacons who would consume the sacraments themselves, while the congregation simply participated by observation. Not very filling, is it? Now, this again is something that happened gradually during the Middle Ages. It seems to be centered around two principles. Were the individuals adequately prepared to receive the sacrament? And also just the practical reality of distributing bread and wine among the community, which, shall we say, had a medieval sensibility on sanitation. There are writings about people, priests in distress about the idea of sacred wine dripping down into the beards of communicants and things like that. And so this is something that's interesting. The sacrament was regularly withheld, but even when it was distributed, only the bread was given to the laity and the wine withheld. Something you'll hear communion under one kind or under one species. You'll see that referred to it as that way sometimes. And the truth is, there really is no point in celebrating the Eucharist if only the priest is going to be consuming the sacrament. And so the wide distribution of the sacrament under both forms became a uniquely Lutheran and later Protestant form of worship. But it took time for the community to regularly be communicants at the Lord's table. This kind of due to lingering questions over worthiness, who was worthy to receive the sacrament. Perhaps forgetting that part of the institution narrative of the sacrament where Jesus says, right, Jesus literally says this, right? This is for the forgiveness of sins. That principle seems to have been forgotten somehow. And this idea that somebody had to prepare to receive the sacrament, this was very, very common in Luther's day. And one of the main ways that one was to be rightly prepared for the sacrament was to go to confession. Now, I say go to confession because it's a little bit different, maybe what we might think of confession today, though we might be familiar because this practice continues in Roman Catholic communities, right? When I say make confession, go to confession, what I mean is that you would go to meet one-on-one with your local priest. There you would name all the sins that you had knowledge of and ask for forgiveness. And then the priest would declare forgiveness, give you a penance, something to do, to enact, sort of forgiveness in your life, say 10 Hail Marys or whatever. And then you could walk away with a clean conscience, at least until you sinned again. Now, the Lutherans would work really, really hard to distinguish between, again, those things that were necessary for right relationship with God and other things that were traditional or beneficial or nice, but which the church had over the years seemed to start to imply that they were actually required for salvation. Or in the case of confession, impose and say, well, you have to receive the sacrament in righteousness, you have to confess all of your sins in person before. So Lutherans and Roman Catholics, they debated this for some time, whether individual confession, where one enumerates all the willful sins committed, was necessary as part of our spiritual lives as Christians. Lutherans said that confession was important, in particular because we need to be confronted with our sin and our iniquity, and we need to hear the words of forgiveness declared to us again and again. And not so much that we need to actually seek the forgiveness of God over and over again to fix our relationship with God. But this does not have to be, these Lutherans, they confess, we confess, that it did not have to be one-on-one, and that it did not have to be a full enumeration of sins. Like, oh, I forgot that thing. Like if I forgot to confess something, it's not like Lutherans believe that sin was, these sins were forgiven and that sin that was forgotten was not, and you have to go and confess your forgotten sin to receive forgiveness for it. Lutherans said that it was important still, but not that it was necessary. So what we see among the Lutherans is confession continues, but the principal form we see is a corporate confession that we do as a group in our Lutheran worship, a form which we still use in our liturgy on most Sundays. But as Lutherans, we do still maintain individual confession, even though it is not common, not as common as among our Roman Catholic siblings in Christ. So you can come to me, come to one of our other pastors and have individual confession. It is in our hymnal. You can look it up. It's in our service book. It is there. But the main, what you might say is the main distinction here is that we don't say that individual confession is necessary for forgiveness. And this really shows you the difference between faith communities that say, this is necessary for your spiritual life, versus a faith community says, well, it's not necessary, but it's still beneficial for your spiritual life. So Roman Catholics still say, they fall into that former group, they still say individual confession is necessary. And so Roman Catholics still very regularly participate as part of their spiritual lives in individual confessions. Lutherans, we still have available individual confession and forgiveness. We fall into that latter category where it's not necessary but beneficial. But even though it still exists as a right today, it is quite rare. As a Lutheran pastor, I'll be honest with you, it hasn't been all that often that I have done individual confession. But I want to commend it over to you, because it can be incredibly beneficial, it can be incredibly healing. Speaking words of corporate confession has a different experience to actually naming sins where guilt and shame are weighing on our heart. So just a pastoral note here. If you are feeling burdened with your guilt and your shame, it can always be a helpful and beneficial thing for you to do individual confession one-on-one with a pastor. And that's part of the ministry that we still provide today. But it is not necessary for forgiveness. It's important to remember that. Now, there's one last specific change that the Lutherans did that I want to look at. It still sort of defines us and our uniqueness as Lutherans, though we may not necessarily think about it all that much. And it involves the liturgical calendar, that cycle of festivals, which are still used today and was used in medieval Europe back then. You are perhaps at least casually familiar with the reality that during the Middle Ages, Christian communities really very commonly celebrated a number of feast days and saint days. These were occasions of celebration, not just in the spiritual life of the community, but in their civic life as well. These were their holidays, if you will. And you have to think for a moment, like, this is a society that did not have a civic calendar with appointed, holidays. There were no bank holidays. There was no paid time off. There really wasn't even a concept of a weekend. So these feasts, these festivals, these celebrations, they were of significant cultural importance to these people. And consider for a moment, that the word holiday in English literally comes from the phrase holy day, holiday, holy day. And you can see there is a deep connection between the celebrations of the church and the society at large. So there were cultural things that were ingrained here. But these saints' days and other local traditions, there were many, many, many. Far more than we can get to in today, and far more than Luther or anybody was willing to say. These are good and these are bad, But the Lutherans were, generally speaking, it wasn't so much that they didn't like these celebrations, that they just detested them and they're like, oh, I don't like them, let's get rid of them. It was more than a perspective that they felt like the saints' days and other celebrations, that they were distracting people from the central stories of Christ, of Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection, which forms the core of our spiritual lives in community. So the Lutherans, they pared back these celebrations quite noticeably, and they focused really on the celebrations of Jesus' life and ministry. So things like the Transfiguration, Easter, Christmas, Epiphany, they all remained on the liturgical calendar. Other celebrations, which were just other things, maybe not focused principally around Jesus' life, things like Corpus Christi, or commemorations of saints, other saints, were just greatly condensed and reduced, with a high preference on celebrating only those saints which figure in Jesus' life or whose stories are contained within the Bible. So these other saints, they were taken out entirely, or their importance was greatly reduced. So, we still have on our calendar celebrations of St. Peter, St. John the Baptist, St. Paul, all kept. But other saints' days of latter use were often taken out or just greatly reduced. So, for example, we still have our St. Lucia celebrations in December. We still have our St. Nicholas celebrations. We still have our St. Patrick celebrations. But these are more closely tied to the local, regional celebrations or civic celebrations of the festivals that started as church feast days. Now, if you open up your ELW, you will find at the beginning a calendar of saints and saint day celebrations. And not just saints, people like Peter and Paul, but modern saints, if you will. We commemorate Johann Sebastian Bach. We commemorate Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. We commemorate Martin Luther King Jr. So we have a whole witness of a body of saints that we commemorate too. But again, in Luther's day, in this inception, it was very much about paring them down and reducing to just the core festivals and feasts and the core saint day celebrations. So what are our principles of worship and our Lutheran theology of worship? Well, we see a deep connection to our history and tradition, to the universality and Catholicity of our worship practices that we see enjoyed by Christians in many different times and places. Yet that history and tradition should not be confused with what is actually required and expected by God for a right relationship with God and one another. There are many things that can be beneficial or joyful in our spiritual lives, but we shouldn't confuse them with what is necessary. We do gather for worship wearing vestments, we use candles, we sing hymns, but we distinguish what is necessary from what is edifying. In our worship lives, we do strive for all to participate. Worship is not an observation or an entertainment. So we aren't always going to pick your favorite hymn or prayer. Instead, we have a tradition that is both Catholic and Lutheran and also evangelical. That is, our worship proclaims in word and deed the good news of Jesus Christ. In Luther's day, that meant transforming the liturgy from Latin into the vernacular German, singing hymns that provided faith instruction, distinguishing individual confession from corporate confession, distributing the sacrament to all, and focusing on the life of Christ rather than the life of his human imitators. We are all inheritors of these worship principles, and they shape and form our worship lives together today. I wonder what reforms and changes are taking place even now in our liturgy, as we still strive to connect ourselves to our roots and to look to the context of today and the future to address the spiritual needs of our community of faith. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope this has given you some thoughts, some things to reflect on, and maybe the next time that you join us for worship, a little deeper understanding of what we do and why we do it. Thanks so much for joining me, and peace be with you all.